The Shepnaz podcast begins now.
You are listening to the Shepnaz podcast, and here at Shepherd Church, everything we do is to connect our community in a meaningful relationship with Christ. I'm Pastor Rob. I'm your guest host today, sitting in for Pastor Joey, who's still doing baby duty. His wife just had a baby, and he's helping her out, and they're getting acclimated to their new size family. They're now playing zone defense instead of man-to-man. They have 3 kids instead of 2, so they're learning all that. Today, we're pleased to have via Zoom Brandon Sipes. Brandon is the disaster management and humanitarian crisis advisor for Nazarene Compassionate Ministries. That's a lot. Doesn't fit on a business card very well. Yeah. Brandon's work focuses on coordinating emergency response and recovery, in addition to the development of peacebuilding programs to the church. He lives here in Ohio with his 2 children and his wife, who is an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene. So, Brandon, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, grateful, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you again for taking the time. Before we jump into what we want to talk about a little bit, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you, tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in Central Ohio for the most part. We moved around a little as I was a kid, but have lived in this area of Ohio for a long time. My wife and I have been married for a little over 21 years. It'll be 22 this year. We took a nice big trip with our kids this past summer to celebrate our 20th anniversary. So that was really excellent. Great. She has been an ordained elder in the church for about 20 years also.
Wow.
Has known since she was 8 years old that she wanted to be a pastor, and has loved and fulfilled that calling in her life. And I am only grateful to be a pastor's wife to her as well as I possibly can.
Yeah.
So I was, my wife is like 4th generation Nazarene or something. She's got, probably 15 pastors in her family going back to Pilot Point, Texas. And I was.
That's all the way back.
Yeah. And I was a van kid that got picked up from our church in Mount Sterling, Ohio, that little town not too far from where I live now in Springfield. So
yeah, awesome.
Yeah. So I came to Nazarene Compassionate Ministries about 5 or 6 years ago and worked on some mentoring programs initially, and then moved from that into the area of work that I'm doing now. Mm-hmm. My background before NCM was working as a mediator in situations of conflict, primarily in the Middle East. And so when NCM asked me to come on board, a large part of it was about working with people who are in crisis. And for now, that means people who've experienced an earthquake, a disaster, all the way through to immigration work and displacement, conflict, and crisis. So I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity to support our churches globally as they serve really vulnerable people in really difficult circumstances.
Yeah. Wow.
Personal connection to Shepherd Church. I've been there many times, while I was at Mount Vernon, but to play drums or to be in the choir. I think they brought Collegians Choir a couple times to Shepherd, and we sang. But the most meaningful memory I have from Shepherd Church was around that same time. So this would have been, close to 25 years ago. I was playing drums for a service, and it was a communion service. Mm-hmm. And I remember as they were distributing the elements, there was a man in the back of the sanctuary in a wheelchair. And if I had to guess, I would say he had a very severe case of MS or cerebral palsy. And so he's in this wheelchair, he's in the back, and someone forgot to give him the elements while he was in the back. And I remember as the pastor was giving the instructions about taking the elements, he unlocked the brakes with much effort on his wheelchair and started pulling himself up to the front of the sanctuary so that he could receive the elements of communion. I have never forgotten it, ever. It has. I still remember every second of him wanting to be at the front of that congregation, and then people recognizing what was happening and coming in and serving. Yeah. It was amazing. So it's probably my favorite memory of Shepherd.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, well, obviously important for him to be able to participate and willing to do that. So that's cool. Awesome. Very cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. So Well, we wanted to talk to you a little bit about what's been going on in the world. And you'd mentioned that you work with NCM. And for those who may not know, that stands for Nazarene Compassionate Ministries. And one of the reasons we wanted to talk to Brandon is because on February 6th, there was a catastrophic and destructive earthquake that struck southern and central Turkey, as well as northern and western Syria. And as of February 15th, Reuters has reported the following statistics: at least 41,000 deaths, nearly 115,000 with non-fatal injuries, 2.4 million people displaced, 24 million people affected, about 6,589 buildings destroyed, and roughly $50 to $85 billion in property damage. And we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll talk with Brandon about the reports that he is hearing and how Nazarene Compassionate Ministries is responding and how we could potentially respond as well. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Countless people experience God's blessings when they tithe, but often the first step is the hardest one to take. The 90-day tithe challenge, a money-back guarantee of sorts. Essentially, it's a contract based on God's promise in Malachi 3, 10, and 11. See, the Bible asks us to give our first and our best back to God, and He will bless the rest. We return to the Lord 10% of what He's given us because it belongs to Him. If you're not tithing already, a great way to start is with the 90-day tithe challenge. We commit to you that if you tithe for 3 months and God doesn't hold true to His promises of blessings, we'll refund 100% of your tithe, no questions asked. All you got to do is fill out the Connect card and click the button that says 90-Day Tithe Challenge. We'll sign you up and we'll be able to walk with you through those 3 months and see all the good that God will do in your life.
All right, well, we're back with Brandon Sipes, who is with Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, and we wanted to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the world and the Nazarene Compassionate Ministries response. And so, Brandon, we are aware of the earthquake that happened in northern Syria, southern Turkey, and tell us what kind of mission presence did we have in these areas prior to the earthquake?
Yeah, so just generally, our posture at Nazarene Compassionate Ministries is we really operate through our churches. We exist to support the work of the church wherever we are. And so sometimes that will mean there's a disaster or an event where we don't have churches present. And that's the case for Turkey. We don't have any Nazarene congregations. We don't have any missionaries that are working and operating in Turkey. So if we do support any efforts in Turkey, it'll be through some of our partners, Convoy of Hope, Heart to Heart International, Operation Blessings, Send Relief, all of these faith-based organizations that we try to partner with. But for now, we are working with our churches and our congregations in Syria. Syria has had many years, almost 13 years now of civil war and conflict. So already a very vulnerable place.
Yeah.
We had several congregations in Damascus, and now in the north, we have a congregation in Aleppo and a congregation in Latakia, both of which are communities that were very heavily impacted by this earthquake. So
Wow.
In those communities, our churches immediately started sheltering people. Like as soon as the earthquake happened, the churches opened up. People started coming to the churches and were offered shelter. They're distributing food and water. But for the most affected areas, Aleppo and Latakia are the two main congregations and church buildings that we're centering our aid around at this point.
Yeah. Did we have any, you mentioned that we didn't have any people in any Nazarene churches in Turkey, but in Syria, and or any of the churches or people or some of the mission staff there affected by this earthquake?
Yeah, we're still getting some details on that. From what I have read and direct reports from some of our folks that are there now, I have not heard that any of our church buildings have been damaged, or that, for example, our pastors or their families have been displaced. However, I do know that we have congregation members from both of those congregations in both of those cities whose homes have been damaged. And sometimes it's not that the home is destroyed or is even unlivable, but when you have a significant earthquake like this, people are very uncomfortable staying inside their shelter, right?
Yeah.
Every aftershock, and there have been hundreds of them since last week.
Wow.
Every aftershock makes people really anxious about being inside their building. So you have people all across Syria and Turkey right now that are sleeping on the streets simply because they do not feel comfortable being inside their homes or their churches
Yeah.
when if another aftershock happens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we obviously know it's winter here. What is winter in Syria like? Is it cold there? Is it warm? I mean, I don't know.
It is. No, it's cold. And, it might not be, we in Ohio, I think we probably take a little too much pride in not being bothered by the cold. But it is legitimately cold there at this time now in both Turkey and Syria. And this, again, this has been the case for years as refugees were leaving Syria and moving into Turkey. This time of year, it's very cold there. And I have traveled there in January and February to Turkey. And it's I mean, in the US,
Yeah.
they get down into the 20s and 30s there. So people are now, outside in the elements and really struggling
Yeah.
with it. So,
Wow. Wow. So yeah, I can understand, if you've seen buildings around you fall down, you don't want to go to sleep in one, thinking that something might happen. And then of course, being 20 degrees outside doesn't make it very easy to live either. So yeah. Well, can you tell us a little bit about, I mean, we hear reports on the news about what's going on and the numbers are changing all the time, but like how devastating has this been to the area in terms of human loss, structures, infrastructure? I mean, everything's affected when the ground shakes like that.
yeah, you mentioned some of the statistics earlier, and I think the news agency that you referenced is one of the most dependable in terms of just solid unpoliticized direct information. Reuters is really, in my mind, the best place that you can go to get that information. The World Health Organization a couple of days ago said that this is probably the worst disaster this region has experienced in a century.
Wow.
We can think back, you and I and some others who are about our age. We can remember the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami that hit Thailand and all these countries,
Yeah.
and the massive number of deaths and impact that had. But in terms of a Middle Eastern region, this is probably the most significant disaster they've had in a century. And so,
Yeah.
to hear that there are millions of people who cannot stay in their homes, that there are at this point 40,000 plus that have died, and likely to get much higher the more and more that they are able to get into buildings and clean these out. And the impact will go on for a long time. One of the most frustrating things as someone who works in disaster response is, I don't know if you've watched the news today or this week much, but this won't be in the news after this week. And
Yeah.
it's really tragic to think about the scale of this disaster and know that our news agencies in the US and around the world too are really not going to be covering this after this. There's going to be some political event that happens or some reality star that says or does something stupid, and it's going to distract us from
Yeah.
the people who are suffering and vulnerable. And so we move on so quickly. But this need in these areas, it existed before the earthquake. It's made worse by this earthquake, and it's going to go on for a decade or more to help people recover. NCM has just wrapped up a project in Nepal after they had an earthquake in 2015. In November of this past year, we just wrapped that project up, a 7-year project serving people in Nepal who were affected by the earthquake there.
Wow.
And so the need's going to go on for a long time, and unfortunately, it can be difficult to keep people's attention there. So
Yeah.
for the church, it's really critical that we remember these congregations there and commit to them in prayer and support, in just being with them, a sense of solidarity with them as they continue
Yeah.
to work in their communities.
Yeah. Well, I think about the devastation you're talking about, 41,000 people. That's about the population. That's about the size of Gehenna, the city that we live in. And to think that many people just being, losing their life in a day it's that same scale. Unbelievable. And then to think of millions of people being displaced, and like you said, somebody will do something dumb and it will not be in the news anymore because that dumb thing will be covered. And yeah, that's tragic. But it's really encouraging for me to hear you say that, as we're just now wrapping up our aid to Nepal, where something happened 8 years ago. Yeah, that's really cool. Well, when Nazarene Compassionate Ministries goes into an area to help in a situation, what's the process like? I know there's stages of recovery and all that kind of stuff. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on now and how we're helping?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, we really exist to support the church, and sometimes that means, my my very long title, as you noted, it took me a really long time to remember my own title, to be really honest.
Yeah.
The end of it is advisor, right? That's intentional because at Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, like, we don't tell local pastors what to do. We don't tell DSs what to do. We don't go in with field strategy coordinators or regional directors and say, this is what you have to do. But we will often, especially when it comes to disaster, strongly suggest that this is a path forward, or, based on our experience elsewhere. So right now, I can tell you those two churches, as I mentioned, they're sheltering people. They're offering food and water, clothing, winter items, because it's so cold. They're going out into their communities and trying to identify people that have been impacted, who are very vulnerable. One of our values, I think, for the Church of the Nazarene generally, not just Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, one of our values is, how do we identify and serve the most vulnerable in our communities, the people who are most at risk, who need the most support? If another earthquake happens a year from now, who are people who are most likely to be impacted because of how vulnerable they are? So our churches there have been doing that work since hour one, immediately after the earthquake. We have partners like Helping Hands in Germany, which is a Nazarene entity, and other churches that currently right now are traveling to support our churches in Syria. And so sometimes that means sending in funding, bringing funding with you, bringing humanitarian aid supplies with you. But for now, we're still in a very, very early phase of making sure people have those most critical basic human needs: food, water, shelter, safety. Those are the ones that all of our folks are working on the most right now. And as the timeline goes on, and again, as there's less and less emphasis and attention on this disaster, then those needs will start to shift. Like, we'll try to figure out, if your home is destroyed, how do we find a place for you?
Yeah.
As you're dealing with the grief and trauma of what has happened, how do we help counsel you? How do we connect you with counselors and therapists who can work through that with you? As you're wrestling with the spirituality and the theology of, why does this happen? And this is making me question, what is happening in my faith life as a result of it. Like, can our pastors support you? So it'll change over the coming weeks, but right now we really are hyper focused because of how critical the need is for just basic humanitarian effort: food, water, shelter, safety, non-food items, hygiene items. That's where we're at right now, and that's where our focus is right now.
Wow. You had mentioned, getting the supplies to them. Something we do here at Shepherd every year is the crisis care kits. I think we send a couple hundred off every year. Is this the kind of place where those end up sometimes?
Yeah, 100%. I can tell you. So whether people are familiar or not, Syria, as I mentioned earlier, civil war for 12 plus years now, many, many refugees leaving Syria. And one of the places they go to is Lebanon. They're bordered there. Turkey is another one. So they move most often into countries that are right next to them. We have sent more than 10,000 crisis care kits to Lebanon in the last year. Lebanon is experiencing its own crisis right now, and has been for a couple of years, political, economic crisis. And so we have sent some items in, and I guarantee that some of those items we have sent in are now being marshaled and gathered together to use this response. Convoy of Hope that I mentioned earlier is a wonderful partner of ours, and we have partnered with them over the last year to send over 40,000 cases of 40,000 crisis care kits to the Ukraine response. So in Poland and in Ukraine, and being given to people who are experiencing the conflict in that country. So crisis care kits are a very big part of our international response. because we have partners that can mobilize them really quickly, ship them, get them sent there. And in places like Lebanon that has experienced crisis, if they're already there and now they have them on hand and they can support their neighbor country with them, it's a huge benefit. So I love that church to church connection, of a church like Shepherd mobilizing their resources and their people to create something like that ends up at a church in Aleppo, Syria, or Beirut, Lebanon, or Kiev, Ukraine, and it's being given to people who really need it.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful ministry.
Wow, that's cool. So it's cool to think that, if you've participated in a crisis care kit, you turn that in here, we send it in, it could end up anywhere in the world, and something you purchased at, Kroger's is ended up in a kid's hand or a family's hand in one of those places. That's really cool. I also love, Brandon, that we partner with other agencies. We're not just doing it on our own, and we're able to leverage what we're good at and what other people are good at and partner together.
Yeah, we can't do everything on our own, right? So that's one piece of it. Is there are things that these very large agencies can do that we can't do, and so we have to acknowledge that. But one thing I say in every disaster training I do, every church, every faith promise that I'm asked to speak at, one thing that I always say is the church was there before this disaster happened. It's there during the disaster, and it's going to be there for a very long time after. And so it's not a critique of other agencies that come in and support, because you really need that massive support right afterwards, immediately. But at some point, most of them are going to go, like they're going to go and not be deployed in that area, but the church remains. And so that's why we were able to do 8 years in Nepal. That's why we're able to do, many years after in any disaster, is that the church exists in that community and we're not going anywhere. And so we work toward the wholeness of that, the transformation of that community for however long it takes.
Yeah, that's so cool. So cool. Well, last thing, Brandon, is, I know we hear about it. It's going to go away in the news, but we still want to help. What are things that we could do here in Columbus, Ohio, to help? How could we help folks?
Yeah, for sure. So in the disaster field in particular, there's kind of a mantra that floats around, and I think some people are often skeptical of it, but I want to tell you, it's absolutely the right thing to do. The easiest, quickest, most efficient way to support people in this phase of a response is to donate to a trusted organization.
Okay.
The crisis care kits are wonderful. Collecting clothes and trying to send them, that starts to get less efficient, right? And so people have really good hearts and big hearts, and they want to support any way they can. But the reality is that in a disaster response at this phase, the best, most efficient way to get support to people that need it is to donate to an organization you trust. And folks that I've mentioned already, like Convoy of Hope and Operation Blessing and Heart to Heart, those are organizations we partner with all the time. The International Federation of the Red Cross, which in many Arabic and predominantly Muslim countries is called the International Federation of the Red Crescent. That is an organization that you could trust with your funds to go there. Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, we do have a donate link up. If you go to the NCM page and search for Syria, you'll find it there, or look on Facebook for the updates, you'll find it there. So donating funds is one way, for sure. I would say too, find one story from this that resonates with you, and anybody that you can think of to tell that story to, tell that story. So even today, there was a story on the news about two brothers who were carved out of, dug out of the rubble, right? And these two brothers survived together for 10 days in this space. And that's a story, if you share that story about these brothers, that's different than just saying there was a tragic earthquake, it's really bad, would you consider supporting? So find one story that really resonates with you and grasp onto that story, follow up with it if you can, figure out ways to hear what happened to those brothers or whatever. And share that story with people because it keeps people engaged. That individual story is much more powerful. As the church, I would say, not the last, but a final way that you can support is in prayer and solidarity. I got to be in a meeting with some of our other global leaders who are preparing to travel to the region and support them. And part of it was about, preparing them for what it's like to go into a region like that and try to support. But part of it also was just them wanting to know people are praying for them and thinking about them, and that they're not doing this alone. When Hurricane Harvey hit Texas in 2017, we had a church in a creative access area of Africa who took up a donation to send to suburban Houston to support them after the hurricane. We had congregations in Bangladesh who took up an offering. And I think altogether, the congregations in Bangladesh and the congregation in this creative access area, they may have sent $40, maybe. But it didn't matter what the amount was, right? It was the widow's mite. It was this faithful representation that you're not doing this alone. And I know we're distant, and I know we can't do much, but we're thinking of you. We're praying for you. We're Nazarenes. We're in this together. Like, how can we be in this together with you? So for me, that's such a critical part of how and why we do disaster response through our church, is knowing that we're not alone and that we can get to this together.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it that churches in other parts of the world send money here, because we are a global community, and it's so cool. Well, again, one of the things Brandon said was if you wanted to give, you could give. And could you tell us that website again, Brandon, that we could go directly to, or you could give it to the church, and we would forward it. But here's a direct link.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact. I think that it's ncm.org/Syria. I believe that's the link. But if you go to ncm.org and just search for Syria, it should be right there on the front page.
Awesome. Perfect. And if you wanted, you could send it to this church here, and we would make sure that it goes on to Nazarene Compassionate Ministries. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today and just kind of helping us to know a little bit more about Nazarene Compassionate Ministries and how we can respond and what's going on in Turkey and Syria. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, really grateful for Shepherd, for you all who have set this up, and for your energy and commitment to pray for what's happening there. They will be grateful for it, and I will make sure to communicate it to them for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Well, I think that wraps up today's episode. Remember that if you heard something today that resonated with you, reach out to us by emailing podcast@shepnaz.org. Remember, you can also give at ncm.org and click the link there for Syria. Remember, if you're looking around, give us a 5-star review, whatever platform you listen, and share this with a friend. Help spread the word. Make sure you check us out on social media and at shepnaz.org. And for Brandon and Pastor Joey, I'm Pastor Rob. Have a great rest of your day.
This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.